Yeah, so I'm Paula. I've long had a passion for birds and fell into the bird world. And so it's been really great to have an opportunity to be part of the Iona Island Bird Observatory, where um, there are sort of like low barrier points of entry into the wildlife research and conservation sector. Just because sometimes that can be hard to find. And I grew up in Richmond and in Colombia. And so being in Musqueam territory and now being able to sort of give back in some way has been really meaningful to me as I kind of go forward in my career.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us to present today. So I'm similar to Paula. I've been part of WildResearch for a long time. And for me, it's really true to my heart. I kind of got my start as a young biologist. I'm still a young biologist, but moving through my early career phase, and the banding station was where I really learned some incredible skills, and it helped really fuel my passion for birds and conservation. So yeah, really happy to share that with everyone today.
Yeah, so the Iona Island Bird Observatory and our work is based on Musqueam territory. And so Musqueam people for thousands of years have lived on the delta and used to move their villages according to where the water was moving at the time. And so it's a land that whose history is like very intricately connected to who they are as people. And it's been wonderful to get to know some of that history and reflect on what is there today and how that shows, a lot of resilience and also a lot of challenges and overcoming challenges too. And so on the right here is a picture to a resource that Musqueam has put together alongside the Museum of Anthropology. And it's called Musqueam Giving Information About Our Teachings. And if you were to just Google that, there's beautiful videos and animations and community stories that highlight the history of this place that so many of us live in, but haven't, had the exposure necessarily to understanding where we've been and where we're going as well. Yeah, so birds in BC. From our chats before getting started, it sounds like we're all big bird fans, and Nature Vancouver has lots of bird-focused events, which is amazing. In BC, there's been over 500 recorded species of birds, and that's really it's a big number, and it's also a number that has a lot of stories hidden within it in terms of the size of bird, the diet of a bird. They all live such different lives, and it's a really wonderful to get to know them. And even once you start to getting to know them within a species, then you start to see personalities come about. And so it's a lot, yeah, there's a lot to see and to hear. And that's partially because of the diverse habitats that are found here. And so we have coastlines and wetlands and forests and mountains in BC, and in particular where the Iona Island Bird Observatory is, you'll see, is where the ocean meets the Fraser River. And so that mixing of water creates a lot of cool spots for plants and birds to hang out. And some birds stay year-round, and some are only here briefly on their way to their breeding grounds or come here specifically to breed. And the theme, I would say, of today's talk is really feathers. It's all about feathers. So I'd encourage you, if you think you know whose feathers are whose, to put them in the chat and see how yeah, see how you do. But feathers are really at the center of the work that we're doing in studying bird migration because the feathers can help us tell the story of what is happening. And so you have some really different colors and textures and styles of feathers, and they all serve their purpose. And at the same time, the feather structure itself is what we're focused on with migration because as um, things change and flights, as birds fly long distances or short distances, just as like, our clothes get worn down, so do the feathers. And so you can see here on the left, there's the different parts of a feather, which is essentially you have the rachis, which is the middle part, like the vein of the feather, I like to call it. And then you have the offshoots, which are the barbs. And from that, you have barbules, which are really just little hooks. And so you have a lot of like different elements that are hooked together very nicely. And as time goes on, those hooks start to wear out, kind of like an old toothbrush. And that's really what we're looking at when we think about migration and when we think about what a bird is doing and what they can tell us about where they've been. And so this is a yellow rumped warbler wing on the left, a cedar waxwing in the middle, and a violet green swallow on the right. So some of the they're all beautiful, but definitely cedar waxwing and violet green swallows are up there in terms of how striking they are to see, especially up close because they have really sleek feathers that just look kind of like airbrushed. And so the feathers are also connected with leaving the nest, and that's because when a bird is in a nest, it's very vulnerable and it's a very dangerous place to be because you're not necessarily receiving all of the attention 24/7. You're kind of at the mercy of predators if they find you because you can't fly. Weather can also be a factor depending on how good your parents were at choosing a place to build a nest. And so when a bird hatches, they're growing those feathers as fast as they can, and they're growing them all at the same time. And so that fact that they're growing them all at the same time in a bit of a risky place translates to what we see in the feathers. They're all going to look the same age. They're all going to be worn out in the same way. And they're going to be sort of singular, let's say, in their patterns. And that is really important too, for reasons that we'll get to in a little bit. And so bird migration is natural and necessary for a lot of bird species in BC. Because we have such marked seasons, often that translates to limited food availability in the winter and, temperatures that are sometimes too cold for certain birds. And so a lot of birds migrate, and they'll migrate down into Central America, down to Mexico, and down to South America as well. And different species do things differently. Some will travel up to 13,000 kilometers, and some are able to have really amazing adaptations that enable them to fly really long distances over time. And so to be able to do that, they need stopovers to be able to rest and to recover. Because it's kind of like us, when we're for any runners out there, if you're running a marathon, you're going to have to stop and like drink some water and have some extra calories throughout the run. Otherwise, you're not going to be in a good state when you get to the end. And so that's sort of where Iona Island comes in. And so these are some of the migration paths that have been tracked based on birds that have been put where little GPS tags have been put on the birds. And so it's a bit hard to see, but this is essentially North America. You can see Alaska up on the top left. And all of those lines are specific birds that have been, whose paths have been tracked. And you can see there's a lot of different paths, but they are kind of grouped together. And so the group that comes over into the Vancouver area is the Pacific Flyway. And so that's essentially an invisible highway above us that the birds take when they're flying north to their breeding grounds and when they're flying south. And Iona Island is right under it. And so Iona Island's traditional name is xʷməthkվəy in Hunkaminam, the language of the Musqueam people. And it's a very special place. Again, it's where the Fraser River meets the Salish Sea. And so what that means is that there's a lot of mixing of water. And so there's floodplain forests, marshes, wetlands. You have the ponds, and that gives you a good diversity of plants and a good diversity of birds that are both flying over it and are able to spot, or they have it already in their memory that they're able to stop there and get the refuel that they need. And this is an island that has been transformed by people and the water, the movement of the river and the ocean, and by people. And so it's been protected as a park since 1990, but its history and the way that we see it today is very different. Um, and so it's a story of a place that has a lot of resilience because even though it has been through so much, and I'll show you sort of a historical image in a second, it does still have really beautiful spaces. So let me see. So I just wanted to play this video of a morning in May. Actually, I think it was May 15th, a few years ago at the Iona Beach. And those are my footsteps as I make it to the station. So you can hear there's so many birds and there's so much life that you can feel in a place that is also a hub for a lot of like importing and exporting of goods too as the boats move up and down the river. So this is a historical photo of Iona Island. And so at this point in time, it was an actual island. It no longer is an island. And you can see that the river, maybe, let me see, laser pointer. Are you guys able to see this? A laser pointer? Awesome.
Yep.
So you can see up top the river is flowing in down through here, and then on the left is the ocean. But the river also has an arm that extends down below and out into the ocean as well. And at this point in time, the marshes and the land of the island was really fluctuated a lot depending on what the tides were doing. And what we can see, so this is from 1956. There is already a lot of boat activity that you can see up top, but still the island itself is more or less the way that it used to be. And then this is from 2025. And so you can see this bottom arm of the river is now disconnected from the ocean with the causeway. And the island itself is a lot bigger. And so I'll maybe go back and forth just a little bit, especially in the area of the park, actually. And that's because there was a lot of sand that was brought in and infill into the area from other places to stabilize the land. And the jetties were also built. So you can see there's a jetty over here that shoots out, and then there's another one, the North Jetty. And so what that did was it allowed for the narrowing of the Fraser River so that boats could come up and didn't have to worry about the water levels. But it also meant that the waterfowl were affected because there was a lot more pollution. And so for Musqueam people, that meant that they didn't feel safe hunting there anymore. And it also meant that there were deeper waters. And so the shellfish population around the island was also really affected. And that was a really had a really big impact on Musqueam people as well because because the shellfish were a big part of their diet.
Okay, I'm gonna switch gears a little bit now, move away or back up from Iona Island, and talk about how WildResearch kind of came to be and our involvement in Iona Island. And so WildResearch is a nonprofit organization. The main mission is to build, train, and educate a community that contributes to conservation science. So our focus is really on training and allowing folks to learn as they progress in their careers. Right now, we have about 250 members. We're a nonprofit, so we're all volunteer funded or powered. And one of the key things that the founders of WildResearch wanted was to enable kind of this opportunity for biologists, people who are interested in nature and conservation to come together and be able to all appreciate the same things, but learn these skills that are sometimes hard, I think, hard to achieve outside of an academia realm. Um, Most of WildResearch is place-based, and so we operate typically out of the Lower Mainland. Our kind of flagship program, as I'll highlight, is the Iona Island Bird Observatory. So a lot of our focus is in Richmond and Iona Island, but we have members who are across BC. We used to have members who were out on the East Coast. They've now moved back to BC, but we have a wide variety of activities that also occur outside of Iona, and I'll get into that kind of more at the end of the presentation. Next slide. And so we'll touch a little bit now on kind of the Iona Island Bird Observatory. And I apologize, my dog has decided to get up and start walking around as I'm doing this. So if you hear any noise, that's just my dog in the background. So the Iona Island Bird Observatory was created in 2010. Again, it was the flagship program. So this is where oh, sorry, I think this slide. Oh, yeah, that's fine. And so the monitoring occurs every spring and fall. And we have been, like I said, operating since 2010, consistently collecting data for, well, we're 2026, about 17 years. So it's a really long historical data set now, which is really incredible. And like I said, we monitor every spring and fall. And so that's about 6 weeks in the spring and 6 weeks in the fall. So we have quite a lot of data that we're able to collect. And I think probably folks here are familiar with Iona Island. And the slide you saw previously, maybe you've seen our little hut out in Iona Island. Thank you. And so if you are going out to Iona Island, you go to the beach, you kind of go into the parking lot. There's the big pond that you can go, and if you walk kind of between that and the more northern pond, and you keep going until you're almost at the edge of the sewage lagoons, you'll kind of peek through some little trees and shrubs. I believe it's Scotch broom, unfortunately, that's right next to our banding station. But you'll see the banding hut. The hut was not always there since conception. I think they worked on little benches while they were still newer. But in 2013, the hut was built, and it's been standing tall since then, although there are some ongoing issues with the hut that I won't get into. Next slide, please. And so what do we actually do at this banding station? What is banding? Maybe some folks are familiar with what this is, but bird banding is also known as ringing in the UK. And essentially it's putting a band, like a little bracelet, on a bird's leg. But what this band actually signifies is a lot more than just kind of a fancy piece of jewelry. It essentially is a unique ID for that bird. And so each band will have a unique number. And these are really light and safe for the birds. They're made of aluminum. And so it's not actually adding a significant amount of weight to the bird. In North America, each of these banding numbers is linked to a record. And this will allow researchers to identify individual birds over time, which is one of the really key aspects of bird banding. It essentially keeps a record of all of these different species that have had these bands attached. And I just have a couple of photos, and you can see kind of a general sense of our banding operations, which Paula will get into a bit more. Next slide. And I just want to highlight briefly, there's the bird banding office that is run out of both the Canadian and US government. And I think it's important to highlight because bird banding is causing some stress to birds. We limit that to all the extent we can. But one of the attributes of the banding office is that it provides a more ethical and standardized way that people conduct bird banding. So it's done as safely and ethically for the birds as possible. And so this is, I think, really important because a lot of people have concerns over what bird banding is actually doing to the birds and why we're doing it. And so both of the Canadian Wildlife Service and in the US, the United States Geological Service manage all of the bands. They manage the banding records. And essentially, it allows them to control the banding activity across North America. And it ensures this more standardized bird banding and data collection. And it also ensures appropriate data storage. Because if you imagine we are at Iona Island, we are only one bird observatory. There are multiple bird observatories in BC, and then you extrapolate that to across Canada. There's a lot of records coming in, and that's just the bird observatories. That's not individual projects where people are required to band birds. And so the bird banding office will issue banding permits, again, allowing for that standardization and making sure that appropriate people who have the right training are the ones that are going to be handling birds and putting bands on them. Next. I'm going to go really quickly over what bird banding looks like, and then Paula will dive a little bit more into it. But at Iona Island, we are essentially conducting passive collection of data. So we use something called mist nets, where the birds will fly in. We're not using call playback to attract them. The mist nets are just set up, and birds will go in or they won't. And then, so once a bird actually goes into a mist net, we have either an experienced volunteer or one of our banders in charge or banding assistants who will safely extract the bird from the net. Then they put a bird into a little cloth bag, and this is to keep them from becoming more stressed. It's a nice dark place where they don't have to move around a lot, and so it's for their safety that they're put in these. So once that bag is transported from the net, it goes back to the banding hut. And then again, an experienced volunteer or staff will band that bird, put the little band on it, and then process it. And we'll go into what processing a bird actually means in a little bit. And then the bird is released. And next. All right, so probably some folks have seen mist nets before. They're pretty cool. I will say without shame that I have been caught in a mist net before myself, just trying to extract a bird. So the whole idea behind a mist net is the birds are going to not be able to see them. And so that's one of the reasons, in addition to bird activity, that it is better to band really early in the morning. So there's like less light visibility. But as I mentioned, mist nets are, especially at a bird observatory, are passive ways to catch birds. The ones we use are specifically designed for songbirds, so they have a finer mesh. That's the word I'm looking for. And so each net essentially has 5 panels, and then a bird will fly into a panel and kind of get stuck in a little trammel, might get a little tangled. And then it's able to safely sit in the net in between net checks. And at Iona, we have the nets are open for ideally 6 hours each day. This can be a bit variable depending on weather, but that is the ideal time we have them open. And next. This is a great photo. If you can't tell, you are looking at a mist net. You can actually see, unfortunately, this one has a little hole there. We do have some birds like to chew nets, some other things like to chew nets. Nets get holes in them, unfortunately, just with wear and tear, but you can really see how fine that net is. Oh, and I'll let you play this.
Yeah, this is just a video of me extracting a bird from a net. And so they fly into these pockets that are at the different levels of the net, and they kind of just hang out in there, like the bird on the right there. And so it's a lot of like nimble fingers, gently seeing where the net is around the bird and how the bird flew into the net and undoing what the bird did. Sometimes it includes a little foot massage there at the end. But yeah, it's really about taking it slow and kind of like a bit of a puzzle to be able to tell them, yeah, be able to undo what they did.
Yeah, that's exactly how I treat extracting myself is it is kind of like a little puzzle. You approach the net, you see where the bird flew in, you start from there, and then you proceed to slowly take the net off the bird. But that comes with years of experience as well. And I believe, Paula, I'll pass it back to you.
I accidentally pinned myself, but that's okay. Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about going beyond the band and really bird banding is asking these three questions. Who are you? What can you tell us about who you are and how are you doing? And so the who are you question, starts with when we take the bird out of the bag and we see, the colors, the size, the beak shape, and really work on identifying that bird to species and sometimes even to subspecies, depending on what bird it is. And so the bird here we see is a spotted towhee. And so the first step of the who are you is really applying the band. And so you can see these pink pliers have different sized holes, and those holes coincide with all of the different sized bands because all the birds are different. And so they have different sized legs. And we really make sure to and the banding office also has recommendations out to make sure that the band that we put on the bird is the correct size and is not going to be too tight that it, cuts off circulation or something like that, and that it's not going to be too loose that it gets caught on anything. And so this is a really important part of the work is making sure that you put a band on correctly, correct size, and that you look at the number of the band because that number is essentially now that individual bird's name, the way that we kind of identify it. And so this is a slide that I added just earlier today. And so it really kind of drives home the point of unique bands, unique birds. This is a yellow warbler, and it was caught today in a net at the Bird Observatory. And by looking at the number on the band, we were able to find out that it was first banded on May 6th, 2021. And so what that tells me is that, wow, this bird has really good timing because today is May 7th. And again, it has been caught in a net and handled by our staff. And so that probably means that, migration timing for this bird has been pretty consistent. And so it was first banded in 2021, and it was banded as like an adult bird. And so what that data tells us is that this bird is at least 8 years old, which is amazing. Yellow warblers' average lifespan is 2 to 3 years and up to 6 years in the wild. So the fact that this bird is doing so well, and you can see in this picture, it looks very healthy, it looks very happy. Is really amazing. And to me, that always translates in my mind as to like, okay, well, what does that mean about where it's been? Because these tiny birds are able to make such incredible journeys. And so yellow warblers tend to migrate down south into mostly Panama and Guatemala, but as far as northern Colombia. And so that means that this yellow warbler, this is the exact photo we took today, has flown south and back to Canada over 16 times. And this is, all in its little body, which weighs less than a AAA battery. So it's a very incredible journey and very cool to be able to look at those band numbers and be able to have that answer the question of who are you, even, 5 years later. And so the question of what can you tell us about you also goes towards age. And so I mentioned that the birds grow their feathers all at the same time when they're in the nest. And after that, they start to replace them in different ways. And looking at comparing what those fresh replaced feathers look like versus the older feathers that they grew in the nest is what essentially is able to tell us whether the bird is a young bird or an older bird. And so I'm curious if you guys see any difference in these two wings and in the one on the right versus the one on the left. And honestly, I see Chloe's raising her hand. And honestly, this is very difficult. I think, especially for folks that are, just getting into bird watching, you kind of see and like, well, at least I can see that it's a yellow bird, and even that, and it's a small bird, and even that can help a lot. And so when we're looking at the wings specifically, we're looking at all of the edging and all of the colors and the textures as well, as I mentioned. And so we can see these white arrows are pointing to a feather that's called the alula, which shows what I'm trying to show you the most clearly. And so if you look at the feather on the right, on the bird on the right or the top, it has really clear yellow edging, whereas the one on the left has much less edging and the feather's just a bit duller and a bit more brown. And so what that can tell us is that the bird on the left is at least 1 year younger than the bird on the right. The bird on the left has feathers that it grew in the nest. So they're a little bit duller. They're not as nice condition. So it's a hatchier bird because it was caught in the fall. But the bird on the right is looking really great. Those are some very nice feathers. It's an after hatchier bird. It's already replaced some of those feathers. And so this book is like the bird banding Bible. It is very hard to read, as is the Bible, because it's quite a technical document that tells you all about aging the different birds and all of the specific patterns in the growth and the wear of the feathers. And so you're looking at growth bars, which essentially when a bird grows its feather, it's depositing and it's taking energy, from its food to be able to grow that feather. And that can be seen in the condition along the feather. And so sometimes you'll see a line that goes through a feather, and that can tell you, what, when that part of the feather was being grown, unfortunately, this bird wasn't getting a ton of food, or maybe it was stressed or something to that effect, and it wasn't able to produce like a really nice feather. And that can tell us, if you then compare multiple feathers that have those lines, that can tell us, okay, were they grown at the same time? Was one grown differently? And then there's some really specific, like some really fun species-specific traits that we can look at as well, which, just adds to all the things that you need to learn, right? You learn the basics of the feathers, and then you start looking and knowing, oh, well, this sparrow is just a little bit different or does things just a little bit more different. But there are some things, for example, yellow warblers, like the one we saw caught today, when they hatch, the bottom of their beak is actually yellow. And so for a long time, we're able to tell that it's a young bird just based on the color of the bottom of their beak. And then older birds will have a black beak. And so aging is not quite the same as it is in people. We can't quite say the exact age. We're just able to tell whether they hatched this year or whether they're older than that, essentially. And this spring, we know, well, it's spring, no birds are really hatching quite yet, but birds hatched last year. And so today, what we're looking at in the banding station is, okay, did this bird hatch last spring, let's say, last year, or was it before that? And so this is usually how we're able to age them. So it's not really specific ages, but sometimes, like with this yellow warbler that we knew exactly when it was banded, we're able to say, well, this one's not after second year, it's not after third year, it's after seventh year at least. And so it's a lot of, really looking at some fine scales. Sometimes we take out a little magnifying glass to be able to tell the feathers apart and be able to get some insight into aging, which is probably the hardest part of the bird banding process. Then we take a look at sex. And so this is something else that tells us more about the bird. And so I'm curious if you guys know what kind of bird this is. Feel free to add it in the chat, but you can see that the bird on the right. So I guess firstly, I'll say this is the same species of bird in both photos. The one on the right has this really nice black cap versus the one on the left, which you can see up top. It's kind of more of like a browner olive color. And so, this is a Wilson's warbler. And Wilson's warblers are, very special for many reasons, but their name, for example, does not tell you much about them. And so I was kind of wondering, because there are a lot of bird names that are descriptive and a lot that aren't, what's the difference? And I just thought I would share this because I thought it was interesting in how we've sort of changed our mentality. And it's because the Wilson's warbler was described by an ornithologist named whose last name was Wilson. You would think, oh, he named it after himself, right? Like lots of biologists sometimes do that, but no, his name for the Wilson's warbler was green black cat as opposed to Wilson's, which is descriptive and does tell you quite a lot about it. And then someone, years later said, well, there's lots of this Wilson guy has done a lot of good things for the birds and done lots of describing of birds. Let's rename this bird in his honor. And so that was kind of why this name came to be and why there's now a movement to go back to descriptive names because it's a lot harder to be able to, know this as a Wilson's warbler versus, knowing that it's like a black cat warbler. Something else that we're able to learn is breeding status. And so when a bird is incubating eggs, they pluck all of the feathers in their belly so that they can have skin to shell contact with the egg. And then their skin on their belly gets kind of loose and more vascularized so that there's lots of heat transfer to keep the eggs warm. And so by blowing on their belly, we're able to see whether they have this or not. And that will tell us not necessarily that it's a female, because in some bird species, the males do incubate the eggs, but it can tell us, are they breeding right now? And in some species, it can tell us, okay, you're a female. Something else we look at as well is fat. And so this is one of my favorite things to look at because birds have this little pocket here where the arrow is pointing called the furculum. And it's essentially like where the clavicles come together in a bird. And that pocket is their little fat pouch, essentially. And so when birds are migrating and they get lots of food, that will start to fill up. And so we've had birds that arrive at Iona and we band, and they look like this. There's nothing really in there. And then we'll catch them again a few days later and see, wow, like all of a sudden you're bulging. Like some of them will have sort of a yellow or an orange color in that area that will be enlarged. And that just tells you that, they're really finding what they need at Iona. And it's a place that is really providing for the birds on their journey. And then the last two things that we'll look at as well is wing chord and weight. And so that can help us identify the bird and also help us see how they're doing in terms of whether they're gaining weight, whether they're too light. And so that's beyond the band. So you can see, who are you is really answered by what your species is and what your band number is. Then you have what can you tell us about who you are? And that's really the age, the sex, and the wing chord. And then how are you doing is really informed by breeding status, because often, the biological purpose, let's say, of birds is to breed. And so that's always a good sign if a bird is breeding, how much fat they have, and their weight. But we've been talking about the individual bird. And as we know, everything is connected in nature. And as much as we care about the individual, ultimately it's the numbers overall of the birds that we're interested in and seeing the health. And so it's now a collective instead of the individual, how are you doing? It's a collective, how you do.
And speaking of kind of collective, why we band isn't just about the individual birds. So banding, I think it's really important because it's a very cost-effective scientific tool. You need skilled observers and people who are trained, but it doesn't cost a huge amount for folks to do this. And it's really vital data for research, including both monitoring and putting forward initiatives for conservation. And it helps, I think Paula's really hit the nose on this, but it really helps us understand basic scientific knowledge about birds. So how are the birds doing? We can know one bird has been recaptured multiple times. We can know how a suite of those species are doing. based on their banding records. And so we can get a bigger picture, especially when we have multiple years of data feeding into this, and we can get a better idea of overall population health from these banding records. And it also allows additional researchers, I had alluded to before, we're not just band, folks don't just band when they're working at migratory bird stations. There's individual smaller projects done by academia, nonprofit researchers, government that would, depending on the project they're working on, it might not be the focus to just band a whole bunch of birds, but if they're working with birds, if they're putting radio tags on a bird, they will also put a band on a bird. So if that bird gets caught in another location, then we can also look in that record and say, oh, we know this bird was banded at Iona, but then it was recaptured at this project in the Okanagan, for example, or further south or north. And banding is also really important for educational value. And so it provides an outreach and education base for folks to understand more about birds. And I think it also adds to kind of a different appreciation of birds. I think banding data is used in a lot of different ways. I'll kind of jump through this pretty quick. But there's different areas of research and conservation that bird banding supports. I'm going to go into a specific example for that from WildResearch. Banding data is also used to look at monitoring resident and migratory populations. So at Iona, it's a pretty great place because we get a lot of migratory species like warblers coming through, but we also are able to monitor resident species that we see throughout the lower mainland in the winter and the summer. So things like song sparrows, other species of sparrows. And so we're able to monitor those populations. We can also understand more about survival. So we know that yellow warbler has been alive for, what do we say, 8 years? That's a pretty cool record. And that's kind of we don't really get that information many other ways in the bird world. And so we can understand how long that bird has survived. We can understand a little bit more about that bird revisiting the same station every year, or maybe not every year, but it likely comes every year. Maybe we don't catch it every year, but we can understand that site fidelity. And as well, migration routes. So there's multiple stations across BC, across Canada, and you can understand how the birds are moving if they're caught in these different locations. Another way banding data is used is through international monitoring programs and informing both conservation planning and policy. And that's usually when you're really collecting the data and kind of not extrapolating, but examining things at a kind of a bigger picture perspective. We've had lots of individual research, as an example, come through Iona, look at different aspects of behavior, parasite loads for birds, energetics, toxicology. You can also look at genetics. And again, this is all just how the data is being used. Monitoring individuals, as I mentioned before, public education. And I think it's important to highlight that the data we've been collecting at IIBO, or Iona Island Bird Observatory, really contributes to that long-term regional monitoring, and it allows for more international research and conservation efforts. Next slide. One of the other things that is important part of monitoring while we're doing bird banding. So we run for 6 weeks in the spring and fall. And every day we're out banding, we're also running a daily census and daily observations. So I think one thing to highlight is we're not going to get all the birds that are at Iona in our nets. It's specific to songbirds. Sometimes we get the odd raptor or a marsh bird, but typically it's songbirds. But we know, I think for folks who have visited Iona, a huge amount and a larger diversity of birds use Iona. And so the daily census and recording daily observations really gets at a full picture of what's happening during both spring and fall migration. And I think for those who are interested in birding, the daily census can be run by anybody who can identify up to about 70% of the birds. You run it 1 hour after sunrise, so you're out a little bit later than the people who show up at the banding stations. So that's always a plus for some folks. And the same route is run every day for about an hour and a half. And it's a really great way to just contribute to some meaningful conservation data. And then the daily observations are noted by the bander in charge and the banding assistants. And it's just a collection of everything that folks have seen during the day, just to get a understanding of what else is in the area that maybe was missed on census or wasn't showing up in the bird nets. And I think yeah, sorry, next slide, jumping ahead. And so I want to highlight some species that we do catch sometimes in our nets, and so we do have a little bit of data from these really awesome birds. But these are, I think, probably I'm very biased because I love swallows, but these are probably my favorite visitors to Iona. And I wanted to highlight swallows in general because we know, or a lot of folks probably know, that they're in the aerial insectivore group, meaning they eat flying insects. And their populations are not doing very well, generally speaking. There's been about a 43% decline amongst aerial insectivores in general, and that's even more for swallows at about 60% since 1970. The good news is for swallows, we're starting to see a little bit of a leveling off and stability for some populations, but their overall populations are significantly reduced since 1970 levels. And a lot of that is tied into insects, but not just on the breeding grounds. And so I think it's important to highlight how awesome these birds are, but also, they're not all doing super well across the board. And Iona's a really cool place because we get all 7 species of swallows that you see in BC at some point, either probably during spring or fall migration, or some will actually breed at Iona. And so I have photos of all of them up here. I'll let folks maybe pop in the chat if they know and have seen any of these, maybe a bit more recently. But I will highlight that purple martins and tree swallows are kind of the main breeders we'll get at Iona, and probably violet greens as well. But there are other species like barn swallow that nest in nearby locations and frequently use Iona. And I think a really magical time for viewing swallows is in the early evening, just as dusk is hitting. They all will start to form these kind of mixed flock roosts, especially later in after the breeding season. And so you can see multiple species all at once. And it's a really cool feature of Iona. I think that's maybe important to highlight outside of the banding station. And next slide, perfect. And I want to highlight the purple martin because it's kind of a cool conservation recovery story. And it's really nice to highlight what can happen when folks pitch in a little bit for conservation and for species specifically. It is the largest swallow species in BC, and we know they're a long distance migrant. So you can see the range map on the left. The blue is where they spend their winter. So they go quite far. They go all the way to South America, depending on where they're breeding. And their breeding range in BC is very small. It's limited to southern Vancouver Island and the lower mainland. And in the last several decades, there had been some kind of disappearance of the populations. Probably they were finding other areas to nest that might not have been as localized, but people started putting up purple martin nesting boxes. You can see those in the bottom photo. And if you've ever gone to Iona and gone out far to the northern part of the ponds, there's a little walking trail, and you kind of peek out over the river. You can actually see some of the nesting boxes, and um, those are, I think, put up in the last couple of years. And the purple martins have returned. So we know that they were, around the last few decades before, but there had been a transition of just not really seeing purple martins. And this wasn't, Iona Island wasn't the only place this was occurring. And so it's kind of a nice conservation story to just a little bit of human intervention to help bring back these really awesome birds. And next slide. And the last quick little thing I'll highlight is some of the research that's actually come out of Iona Island and the Bird Banding Observatory. So we had about 5, 6 members of WildResearch take 9, 10 years of data. So this was published a few years ago now, but they used data from 2010 to about 2019. And they were looking essentially at how much fat and mass birds were gaining and how that different stopover dynamics between different seasons were linked to different traits of birds. So whether they maybe eat insects or whether they are more generalists, as well as their migration strategy. And I will highlight one of the cool things from this paper is that they found peak warbler spring migration is May 7th, and it just happens to be May 7th today. So I wanted to share that. Although notably things seem a little earlier this year, so maybe we're a little past that. I'll just highlight a couple of the figures that folks produced from this paper. There's a really great larger infographic if you go out to the banding station. I've just taken this quick cutout from that, but it's a really nice graphic you can see and get a little bit more of a fulsome picture of everything that went into this paper. But essentially they looked at warblers versus sparrows, so more of your insectivores versus your generalists, and then also looked at spring versus fall migration to see if there was any differences. And so what this figure is showing is we have our spring information on the top 2 graphs and then fall on the bottom, and then looking at how fuel deposition rate, or essentially how birds are gaining mass over these 2 different seasons, and then how that relates to both temperature, which are your left set of graphs, and precipitation or rainfall, which is your right set of graphs. It's a little convoluted. Essentially, the take home from this is that they found birds are actually gaining mass more quickly with temperatures increasing, which makes sense. More food abundance, easier supply. So they're quickly eating. But when you have an increase in rain or precipitation, you're going to have less mass gain, which I think also is relatively intuitive. The other kind of key takeaway from this is that there were greater weather effects in the spring. And so you can see on the left, far left graph, the warblers are really showing a significant trend in terms of how much fuel they're gaining as temperatures increasing, whereas the sparrows, it's not very significant. And you could see that trend is quite obvious in spring. But in the fall, it was a lot less of a pronounced trend. And I think this also makes sense because we have species that are arriving at Iona. They're wanting to gain mass quickly, get to where they're going, and they want to start breeding. Whereas in the fall, there is less of that pressure to get really quickly down to the wintering grounds. And next slide. This is another figure that essentially shows something similar, that they are gaining mass faster in the spring and they're hurrying up to get to those breeding grounds. So the top graph, you can see um, is the spring, and again, looking at fall on the bottom. And this is highlighting 4 different species. It's maybe a little hard to see, but we have a golden crown in the blue, and then a song sparrow is kind of a purpley color, and then the yellow warbler is that orange, and a yellow rump is, or maybe that's an orange crown. Oh, sorry, I think that's an orange crown. Orange crown is the orange, and the yellow rumped warbler is the red. And so if you look at the top graph, you can see every bird, every species except the song sparrows are really showing quite a significant mass change. And so mass is along the x-axis there, and the y-axis, and stopover length, how many days they're staying at Iona, is on the x-axis. So more mass is being gained the longer they stay, and it's more significant for those kind of 3 species in the spring. And then song sparrows are not significant. And then the bottom graph is a little less pronounced because, again, you're looking to gain more mass faster to get up to your breeding grounds. Back to you, Paula.
Yeah, I wanted to share a little bit about a project that I've been working on, which actually I recognize some names that are here with us today from helping out with the project, which is awesome. So Stories in Flight is a community project that has been taking place throughout the last fall and into the spring and is sort of more in the final stages now. My hope was really to blend art, science, and land connection so that I could share some of the stories and some of the things that I've noticed and that other volunteers have noticed being at Iona every day, and the things that we say as we're at the banding station and we start to see the first birds of the season, and we say like, oh, the yellow warblers are here, or oh, the Wilson's warblers are here. And so just trying to see like what does that actually look like? What does the data tell us? We're sort of doing it anecdotally based on our own experiences, but we have all this data, and it'd be great to see some of those stories that data can tell us about the birds. And so for me, it was really important to have art be a way of doing that. And so there's some watercolor art from a volunteer named Julia Avison. And the idea is to have some plant signs and an interpretive poster and a mural at the banding station. It was looking like that's more realistic for fall, just because collaboration takes time. But um, it sort of culminated in February with a community event that was a plant walk led by Musqueam knowledge holder Manuel Axel Strain, who also did the mural. And so it was really lovely to be able to see folks who contributed to the project come together and do a little walk. It was only February, but we could already see in the plants so many signs of spring and so many signs of transformation. So this is sort of the big graph, let's say, that ultimately started and centered the project. And my hope was really to help folks connect with the rhythms around Iona. And so that, when you're at the banding station, you have an idea of what to expect because there are, patterns and the birds that migrate through Iona do so in waves. And so, you know, this sort of highlights the different strategies that the birds have. And I looked at 11 years of banding data to be able to see, yeah, when birds come through. And so this is spring specifically, which is great because it's spring. So this is very relevant to what we're seeing now. And so if you can see here, let me turn on my laser pointer. The ruby-crowned kinglet and golden-crowned kinglet are definitely like the ones that are the highest at the very start of the spring. And that is what we saw this year as well. And they tend to start to go down because they move a little bit faster. And so these are the first to arrive because they're a little bit more cold tolerant, and they're able to feed on the insects that are hidden in the tree needles and in bark, as opposed to having to wait for things to bloom and to kind of for the weather to warm up for the other insects. And so the birds that arrive next are more of the short distance migrants. And so they're able to arrive a little bit quicker. They're not coming from as far away. And the birds that arrive sort of that tend to peak last are the long distance ones who are coming from Central and South America. And so this, yeah, sort of helps tell us story of what we can see at the station and what the birds are doing. And so if you look at the May, 7th area, let's say, you're seeing a lot of orange-crowned warblers and a lot of Wilson's warblers. And I can tell you I was out yesterday and the top birds we caught were those two species. So that's great to see. And overall, it's just, yeah, a really visual way of thinking about when the birds are coming through Iona. And so the idea is to have this printed pretty large and have it at the hut for volunteers and for the public who come outside of breeding season to be able to see and to connect with the birds that they see around Iona and learn a little bit more about their stories. And so pop quiz. We did talk about this bird already, but I'm curious if anyone remembers what bird this is, because this is a bird that in the spring especially is very interesting in terms of what they do. And so I'll go back to here. I guess it gives the answer away now that I think about it. But you can see this is the Wilson's warbler, and you can look at the wave and notice that it's quite a large wave. They start, it's a little bit hidden here, but they start probably towards the end of April arriving. And then they kind of like their numbers still stay here. We keep banding them and keep banding them and keep banding them all the way through to the end of May. And which is when the season ends. So it's not that they're not here anymore. It's just that we're not there anymore, banding them. And so that's really interesting because usually it's more pronounced waves. Like you can see this one, the yellow-rumped warbler, they peak and then they pass through and then they leave. And so what's interesting about the Wilson's warblers is that first, they're the most banded bird in the spring. And so we catch a lot of them. And they're around the station for over half of the monitoring season. And this is primarily due to the fact that the males and the females kind of migrate separately. And so they arrive at Iona separately, which stretches out their wave. And so you can see here, the females, which are the orange, tend to arrive after the males, which are the blue. And part of that is because they fly separately, but also part of it is because Wilson's warblers do what's called a leapfrog migration, which means if you have a population that's breeding in the north and one in the south, it's not like they both move. They both move south for the winter. The northern population will travel farther south than the southern population. So they'll actually sort of jump over them, let's say, in time, which is why it's called leapfrog migration. And so it's kind of an interesting thing because it means that we see them a lot longer, and it means that when you're catching them, you're like, am I identifying this right? Are you actually a male? Are you actually a female? Because we keep getting only males or only females. But then you start to, think about what they're actually doing, and it starts to make sense. And so now at this point, we're getting it still mostly males, but the females should start arriving soon. So we talked a lot about birds, but I did want to acknowledge, again, everything is interconnected and the birds wouldn't be at Iona if it wasn't for all the plants and all of the insects. And so that's a really big part of the project as well, is having sort of signage that highlights the native plants that are around. And so that was the focus of the walk in February. And this is a picture from the walk where we were at the side of the ocean. And kind of learning about the history of the plants and having, lots of volunteers who provided photos and provided permissions and knowledge and all sorts of things to help the project. And you can see on the bottom here, this is the mural that the artist Manuel created. And so it really focuses on the indigenous understanding of birds as relatives. And so he shared that in Coast Salish creation stories, there were people, and then the transformer came and transformed these people into birds and into rocks and into plants. And so everything comes from the original people. And so it's sort of aligned in many ways with, the theory of evolution, let's say, of us having a common ancestor, but it really highlights that birds are our relatives, and in all the ways that we rely on this world, so do the birds, and kind of highlights that reciprocity that's needed in how we walk about every day in our life. And so, yeah, walks are a big part of WildResearch as well. And so this is, yeah, sort of some of the other programs that Chloe would speak to.
Yeah, I know we're a little over our time, so I'll just quickly highlight we have a BC marsh monitoring program that we run in April, March and April to use call playbacks to monitor both amphibians and birds. We also have an urban raptor monitoring program, which focuses on Cooper's hawks, and that has also just wrapped up. We do that throughout April. Yeah, and then we also have winter and spring bird walks. We've also been doing lots of different workshops, focusing a little less on birds, a little more on plants and ecosystem identification. We do social nights as well for our members. Yeah, a little pitch there. I think, yeah, and that's everything. Big thank you to everyone for coming out.